Welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from revolutionaries in the animal rights movement who, through their creativity, skills, and unique talents, are making massive strides for the animals. My name is Shriya, and I am so excited to be your host for this episode. Today, I sat down with the remarkable Katie Cantrell, the Director for Corporate Outreach at the Better Food Foundation. Katie works alongside corporations, catering businesses, conference organizers, and so much more to help them offer a planet-friendly, delicious, plant-powered menu by default. Isn't that amazing? And prior to this, Katie founded the renowned Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, an organization that to this date is celebrated for its dedication to the education-based advocacy for an equitable and sustainable food system. Owing to Katie's background in psychology, she truly values the importance of human behavior and empirical data as critical components in strategizing our advocacy. I cannot wait for you all to hear Katie's words of wisdom. Before we get into this episode, I want to remind you that the Animal Liberation Hour is a project of the Animal Activism Mentorship Program. AAM is a free multinational program that helps aspiring animal rights activists find their voice in the movement and take their activism to a whole nother level. From one-on-one mentorships to free workshops and trainings to this podcast, AAM seeks to empower humans to fight the good fight for all Earthlings. For more information, visit animalactivismmentorship.com and follow AAM on social media. That's Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship. You can also keep up with the Animal Liberation Hour on AAM socials as well. Animal Activism Mentorship is so honored and proud to be fueled by Farm Animal Rights Movement. Now to the episode to be inspired by the brilliant Katie Cantrell. Enjoy! So thank you so much, Katie, for taking the time to join us today on our podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, the pleasure and honor is ours, to be honest. So, we are essentially a podcast where we want to get out remarkable stories of people who are doing work in changing the world for the better for all Earthlings. And this includes our other than human animal companions, our other than human animal Earthlings, and of course, humans as well. So how did you feel inspired or drawn to either the vegan ethic or the animal rights movement in the first place?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. I went vegetarian in high school. I've always been an animal lover, and I actually tried to start an animal rights club at my high school, but I couldn't find a faculty sponsor. But I grew up in LA, so a lot of people there were vegetarian. I had other friends who were vegetarian. It wasn't like hugely out of the norm or anything. And then I went to UC Berkeley, and one of the first things I did when I got to campus was join the Berkeley Organization for Animal Advocacy. So that's where pretty much everyone in there was vegan. So I, went from vegetarian to vegan, and I really cut my teeth as an activist. And that's where I learned about factory farming, and that became like my main life's work. Basically, before that, I just kind of had a general sense that I wanted to help animals. And then I learned that farmed animals are really by far the most exploited animals on the planet.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that trajectory of going vegetarian and thinking like, oh yeah, I'm doing everything. And then you learn more, and it can be daunting, and having that community where you could be amongst a group of vegans and animal rights activists is so valuable to connect with that ethic and, and stay true to it. So what was the initial spark though? Because I do hear of stories often that, I always loved animals, and and then I decided to go vegetarian. But was there something that connected that bridge between loving animals and going vegetarian? Was there something that you watched or something that you read or an experience with an animal that really opened your awareness to that?
It's funny, I get asked this a lot, but I don't even honestly remember like the moment I decided to be vegetarian. Again, because I knew a lot of people who were vegetarian and my family would go to vegetarian restaurants sometimes. Like it wasn't as huge of a deal as it is for folks who live in places where it's unheard of or like have very conservative families where like it's kind of a defining moment to become a vegetarian. I think, I mean, honestly, probably like The Simpsons helped plant the idea, like when, the episode Lisa becomes a vegetarian.
Yeah.
I think just a lot of like subtle cultural influences had helped kind of implant this idea that people who love animals are often vegetarian. And so it was just sort of a natural progression of like, well, I love animals, maybe I should be a vegetarian. But there wasn't any like one spark or like light bulb moment for me. In terms of going vegetarian, going vegan was different because the people in the animal rights group, they were very polite and very kind and very gentle about it, but they did push me and, challenge me to consider like, if I'm vegetarian because I love animals, then why would I eat dairy products from cows that end up becoming hamburger meat? And so once that connection was made for me, then that was more of a light bulb moment. And I was like, oh yeah, to be ethically consistent, I really should be vegan and not vegetarian.
That is very beautifully said. And I personally relate to that a lot as well. Like, I was raised a vegetarian, but it was not so much from an ethical standpoint. It was more of a cultural thing. But the vegan angle, definitely there was a lot of ethics involved. But, just it seems like once you become a vegan, it's easy to say, hey, like this is so obvious. Once you know how these dairy cows are treated or how the layer hens are treated, why would it be so difficult to make that transition? But when you're actually in that phase, it is hard. From your experience, do you think you have a sense of what complicates that? What about that knowledge connected to action is so difficult for ourselves and other people who we want to make that switch immediately?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think there's a lot of layers to it. I mean, one is just, and this goes for becoming vegetarian or vegan, something that I don't think people give enough weight to is just how transformative it is of people's entire worldview. Like it's very deeply disturbing and like disconcerting to realize that like all of these like staples of our daily lives and our culture and our families and also all of these institutions are basically lying to us and are propping up this industry that is just utterly horrific, like unspeakably terrible. And it's so infiltrated into daily life. And so I think there's a lot of us who want to pretend that it's really easy to go vegan. And in some ways it is much easier than people think it is, like certainly in terms of the food, like it's easy to eat really delicious food, but it is a big step mentally to start to unpack like all that goes into the food system and how that, interacts with our lives and our culture and our friends and our families. Like, and I think it can be really quite intimidating and overwhelming to people. And so I try as much as I can, and I really encourage other activists to be compassionate and to, I know I was an angry young activist once, like I
I
yelled at
think
my
we
family
all
and
were.
friends. Yeah, totally. So I know like once you see it, like you can't unsee it. And then it's like, how could anyone be blind to this? And how could they participate in this terrible system? But, remembering that it is a big step for people to take. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge barrier. And then, it's funny, like when I was vegetarian in high school, there was someone in the grade above me who was vegan. And I remember like I kind of made fun of him. I brought brownies to school once and he was like, oh, I can't eat those. They have egg in them, or milk or whatever it was. And, I kind of made fun of him and I would told my friends like, oh, vegans just want to like stand out and think they're cool. Like they're just trying to be difficult. Like I would never be vegan. That there's just all these negative cultural stereotypes out there and people, if they haven't seen that connection yet, it's easy to buy into that and feel like, well, I'm already vegetarian. I'm doing more than 90% of the population. That's enough. Like, why should I have to like go to this extreme? And again, like I mean, probably touch on this more, but a lot of my career has been about like finding common ground with people and trying to like empathize with them and encourage them to go further. I know there's a lot of judgment and hostility often from vegans towards vegetarians, but I think that, they're most of the way there. It's just about encouraging that next step.
Yeah, and I think that often becomes the reason why there is that, little extra bit of hostility, if you will, because it's like you're almost there. And yet, but I totally get that. And it just comes back to the value of community and the value of support, because I'm sure you're aware of the data that shows that a major cause of recidivism from the plant-based space is the lack of community and the social dilemma. And I think being able to show that, you can be a normal person and enjoy your everyday life in this with this lifestyle is important. And
Absolutely.
I think that should really frame the way we do activism as well. And so when you went vegan, you finally made that connection. Did you feel called to also participate as an activist, so become more active in making your voice heard on behalf of these animals?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I already felt called to activism. Like I had already joined this animal advocacy group. And so the two things kind of happened simultaneously. And actually, when I was in high school, I would leave PETA to have those little like vegetarian starter guides. I guess back then it was still a website. I don't know. I'm old. I'm like in that transition. When I was in high school, it was like starting to get, like more online stuff.
With the pandemic, honestly, I feel like everything merges anyway. So
yeah.
I don't know what day it is anymore.
Yeah, but I would leave those little cards. They said like, I think it might have been a phone number that you called back then to order a vegetarian starter guide. I would leave
Okay,
those
that does sound like a long time ago.
yeah, it was the early aughts. So, I did do some activism in high school and I would like sign petitions and stuff like that. And again, I wish I could like point to some defining moment, but I'm not sure exactly what it is like about me or my upbringing that I felt called to activism from a pretty early age. But then, yeah, I mean, when I went to Berkeley, like I got involved to be an activist, and it was in doing so that they kind of encouraged me to become vegan. So those two things were always very intertwined for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And of course, I think with all the connections that you made and proceeding on to advocate for farmed animals, that which has become a huge part of your role as an advocate in this movement, which is, it's also funny that you mentioned to your friend, like, I would never go vegan, and here you are, one of the leaders in the vegan movement, which is remarkable. So let's talk about your journey in starting your own organization and raising awareness about animals who are raised for food in the factory farming system.
I like to tell that story, and actually a friend of mine has a really great story that happened to a friend of hers who he was in university, and there was an animal rights group tabling, and he was like, animal rights is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And so he went up to the table basically to make fun of them. And they were really nice to him. They were very polite. And like every day he would like think of questions to stump them and like expose how stupid they were. And he would go up and like pose these questions and they would answer them really seriously. And like eventually he couldn't think of anything else. And he was like, maybe there's something to this. And eventually he went vegan and worked for PETA. So like I like to tell that story in my story.
I love
as
that.
like,
It's so funny that you say that. Is when I first went vegan, I was also like, oh, I'm not the PETA vegan. Like, I'm just doing my own thing. And now I work for PETA and I'm very proud and happy of what we're doing. So it's just really funny how you think about things and it's like, oh, things change.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, things change and people change. So I really like to encourage people to like be gentle and patient. Like the main thing is just leave a positive impression that encourages the person to keep having those conversations and like keep going down that road. And if someone's hostile or an asshole at first, like you still never know what will come of it. So yeah, I like to tell people that and to encourage them not to be discouraged. But yeah, I mean, in terms of my own journey, so I was in BOA for all 4 years that I was at UC Berkeley in undergrad. I became president of the group, and that was really formative for me. I leafleted a lot with vegan outreach and just became really connected to the Bay Area vegan scene. It was a really wonderful, supportive community back then. And a pretty small community back then too, like the animal rights movement as a whole. I feel like there were folks who had been working in it, for a couple decades, but it was still like, I feel like it's grown a lot in the last 10 years. And back then it still felt like a small community. So yeah, I got connected. And once I graduated from UC Berkeley, I knew that I wanted to do activism. Like I felt called to that as my life's work. I wasn't expecting to get a paid job doing activism. I just wanted to do it as like a volunteer project. But I didn't know, it felt very overwhelming to try to decide, like, once my world wasn't UC Berkeley, but like was the whole world, like, how do I make a difference? What do I do that's really worthwhile? So I was kind of overwhelmed for like a few months. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I read Eating Animals by Jonathan Foer and was really moved by the holistic approach that he takes to factory farming. So this was back in like 2009, 2010. And back then, the only groups that were talking about factory farming were animal rights groups. Even environmental groups weren't really addressing it at all. And so to see it so clearly laid out as not just an animal rights issue, but also a social justice issue, a public health issue, environmental issue, it just seems so like glaringly obvious that this industry is terrible any way you cut it. And that there are all these audiences who should be really moved to want to end factory farming when it's presented from these other angles, but who aren't necessarily going to be drawn in when it's just presented as an animal rights issue. And so that's what motivated me to start FFAC. There weren't any other groups back then taking that more holistic approach to the issue. And so I was also really excited about the facts that it was peer-reviewed research, like tons of citations, because back then it was actually hard to get really legitimate statistics. There was a lot of groups would cite stuff from like Diet for a New America that had come out like decades before. And, who knows how accurate it even was to begin with. So, feeling like I had like really legitimate statistics that I could like defend if challenged. And with this perspective that I felt was really, convincing to a wider audience, I wanted to go out and just start spreading the word however I could to as many people as I could. So yeah, that motivated me to start FFAC. And I initially was just going out and trying to speak to really whoever I could get in front of. So I had just graduated from college and I lived in the student co-ops at UC Berkeley. There's like 12 co-ops, I think, and like 1,600 students, maybe more. It's a really great network and like very progressive minded students. So initially I started out just giving talks at the student co-ops, and I was right. Like the students were super into it. Like people who would have been kind of hostile to animal rights, like they were environmentalists and social justice activists. And so they really wanted to learn about how the food system like impacts those things. And then, they recommended me to speak to like student groups and eventually to classes. And so I just very slowly and organically grew this effort. And, I was friends with a lot of people in the animal rights movement who wanted to volunteer. They liked what I was doing. And so, yeah, it grew very slowly just from this idea.
And look at what it's become. It's like, it's such a valuable resource in this space in education, advocacy, and student outreach. And there's so many students who also volunteer, which is absolutely remarkable what it's grown to become. And it's all your dedication and the motivation along the way. So thank you for creating such an important piece that we really need in this space, not just for, like you said, not just the animal rights standpoint, but from a holistic perspective, the social justice angle, the environmental justice angle. It's central to all of that. And I think it's also a very key element that shows that all of these oppressions and injustices are connected, and the system of oppression is similar in all these cases. And so in a way it does seem daunting, but at the same time it's also, if we fix one, it could have that chain reaction and you might be able to fix all of these, or at least start to fix all of these issues. So I think that's a very valuable connection that you had made after reading the book, which I'm sure has, from my understanding, has created a lot of vegans and activists as well along the way. So you did touch on a lot of the factory farming angle and its impacts on the environment and social justice. But now we're also, with the environmental movement, we're seeing some pushback, and also, and this is from the animal agricultural space, and at least transitioning into these more quote unquote regenerative agricultural practices that still uses animals in these practices. So what is your stance on that, or do you have any opinions? And of course, this is just your personal opinion that I'm curious to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see that angle grow tremendously over the last 10 years. It's something that, like in the Bay Area, people often, more wealthy white people would bring that up, who are buying organic meat at Whole Foods, or maybe, buying at the farmer's market. It's something I would hear like here and there, like, oh, but what about sustainable meat? And now Big Ag has, like you said, has really taken that on, and they're pushing that as a way to delegitimize calls to eat less meat. And I mean, to me personally, like actually small scale pasture raised meat, like I'm certainly never going to eat it, because if I don't have to take an animal's life, I won't. But, to me, like that's not what I'm working against. That's not, doesn't rise to the level of concern that like I'm dedicating my life to fighting it. Like factory farming is what I'm fighting. But there's just like really basic math here that small scale system of agriculture like can only produce a tiny percentage of the amount of meat that people are currently eating. And I forget the exact numbers, but I think Matthew Hayek, some folks have recently done those calculations. And I think it's like would require like a 70% reduction in the amount of beef that people are consuming to actually be able to eat it from pasture based. I mean, the other piece
Scale
of it is
that we're looking, right? Like if we want
yes,
everyone who are still everyone who's still consuming animal products to be able to do so, there's still going to have to be a scale back if the system is going to be everyone eats this pasture raised out in the field happy cow, basically.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of junk science behind the movement, because there's some people who say like, actually, we need more cows. Like what's better for the environment is having more cows. And that, like Alan Savory has been totally debunked. Like it's junk science that's just motivated by profit. But, and the other part of it too is that like Center for Biological Diversity and Stephanie Feldstein do a really great job of talking about how damaging even pasture raised beef is to wildlife, especially, and the degradation of wild ecosystems. So that's something else I try to talk about. But yeah, it's hard because there's like so many facets to this.
I know, and we're seeing a lot of that now with the wild horses being round up, and that issue is just, I didn't realize how big of an issue it was till, hearing of these roundups and seeing photos of helicopters just scaring these beautiful horses, and they just get taken away, and either, like, who knows what happens to them after. And this is just to create more space for ranchers to have their cattle out grazing. And then what next? Like we're going to start being rounded up to move to make more space for cattle. It just, like you said, if you do the math, it makes no sense to, at least for the scale that the factory farming industry is proposing to do this. And recently I saw this article about, and I don't know if you're familiar with this one, and I can't remember where I read it, but it was that scientists are starting to potty train their cows. Yeah. And I was like, that's like to go in a certain corner so that and then they brought up the nitrates, and then all of the scientific lingo to make it sound like a legitimate solution. But are you going to put in all those resources to train your cows to go to the bathroom in a certain corner rather than just either shift your practice or so?
It is amazing. Like it never ceases to amaze me to what lengths people will go to try to save the meat industry and try to justify like the amount of meat that people are eating. I feel that way about insects too, when people are like, oh, like it's all about cricket burgers. I'm like, would you really rather eat cricket burgers and like black bean burgers? Like
no, I know,
really so palatable. Like people just have to be eating animals in some form.
It blows my mind. And using them as feed for chickens, and then it's like, it's gonna cause like this much percentage less emissions, but then are we going to scale that up? Like, and then there's just so many interesting, nuanced discussions that can be had. Like, if you're going to come from a perspective of the number of lives that are going to be sacrificed. Like with crickets, it's going to be significantly more. So from an ethical standpoint, is that still justified? And yeah.
Well, and also just from an efficiency standpoint,
Yes.
that it's always more efficient to eat lower on the food chain. And if you're farming crickets, there's a great article, I think it was actually either in Time or Newsweek, that I'm always sending to people when they ask about this, that looked at, like, if you're actually raising crickets or other insects, like on a large scale, you have to feed them, and they end up feeding them corn or soy. And so you still have this like basic inefficiency if you're growing corn or soy to feed to the crickets and then feeding the crickets to people, or even worse, to other animals.
I didn't even think of that, because if it's, say, for feed, you're feeding corn, soy, etc. to farmed animals who are then later being consumed by people, but then the cricket is adding another layer if they're being used as feed, so it's probably going to cause more damage. Wow, that's an important point that I didn't occur to me till now. Learn something new every day, don't you?
I'm always having to do research and learn, because there's just so many random angles and questions and challenges that are being posed.
Totally. Yeah. And so you've, throughout your story so far, like, you've always made it a point to emphasize the science and the data, and that how that's always led your form of advocacy. And I think that is super important, because it brings so much credibility, and it's not, it's unlikely that you're going to be pushed away like, oh, you're just another angry vegan. You're presenting the data, you're showing the studies. And it looks like that has also evolved into your current position at the Better Foods Foundation. So would you be willing to talk to us about that transition you made from growing FFAC and then deciding to pursue your next endeavors with Better Foods Foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. And it has been an interesting journey. I think when I started FFAC, I was overly optimistic and naive about what motivated people's behavior. I thought, if I can just get the facts out there to people, if they only knew, then like certainly they would change. And I don't want to underplay that, because people did change. And like I know that like I and everyone who's worked with FFAC, all of our volunteers, like we all have stories of like seeing the light bulb come on. And like, I've talked to people years later who like went vegan because of a presentation, became an activist, they got their family to go vegan. Like I know it does make a huge difference. But it's funny, over the years, like at first the presentations were super fact heavy. And, we were speaking in schools, and that did really help us gain access to academic audiences, because it has more credibility. Like it's fact-based. It's not, we're not there to like proselytize or.
It's not like the ALF coming to give a talk or anything.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're just giving facts about the food system. And so that did really help us gain access. But I learned over time that stories are really what stick with people and what move people overall. This is sort of an aside from my personal journey, but something that I've learned and that might be helpful for folks who are just like, figuring out how to talk to people about this. If you don't have to be super fact-based, if you're not like in front of an academic audience, then I found that like really framing it as your own personal story and sharing like, I was motivated by learning this, and like now I'm doing this and I feel great. Like that really tends to resonate with people. And like, as humans, we just naturally are inclined towards stories, and that's like what sticks with us. So I feel like I had a journey like from facts, like more towards stories. And then recently now I've taken a job with the Better Food Foundation, and it's sort of the opposite approach. With FFAC, I was really trying to educate people and like win hearts and minds, and just to create this like kind of shift in the perception of the food system and like our understanding of it. And now I was a psychology major in undergrad, and one of the things that I learned was that it's not always that attitudes shape behavior, but which is what we tend to think, like, oh, I believe in this, therefore I will take this action. But actually our behavior shapes our attitude a lot of the time. And so if I am doing something then I'm more likely to believe something that's like positive about that type of behavior. Or like, if I regularly do something that's like condemned by a certain religion, like I'm less likely to be interested in like learning about that religion, for instance. And so I was intrigued by this idea of like shaping people's behavior rather than trying to shape their attitudes. And so I was really excited about Default Veg, which is a program of the Better Food Foundation. And the idea is it's rooted in behavioral economics, specifically the book Nudge by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, which I really recommend if you're interested in
Yes, we'll be sure to link all of these resources.
Awesome. Yeah, and looking at like just all of the subtle environmental forces that shape our behavior in ways that we don't even necessarily notice. And one of the main ones is defaults. So, in a lot of different parts of our lives, there are these defaults, which are like, technically a default is, it's the option you end up with if you don't make an active choice. So the most common example is like a ringtone, right? Like most of us probably still have the default ringtone that our phone came with, and like most of the default settings on our phones. But a lot of things are like that in life, and people just tend to stick with the default. So, sometimes that's exploited by companies to make more money. But otherwise, it's not something that has been looked at very much. And so the book Nudge is like all about how we can use defaults and nudges in a way that benefits society. So based on that book, the idea for Default Veg is to make plant-based a default and give people the choice to opt into meat. And there's studies that have found that when plant-based is the default, it results in on average a 60% increase in the amount of people who choose the veg option. Wow. So it's way more impactful than any other intervention.
And this is even when meat is offered as an opt-in? Wow.
Yes. Yeah, so they've done it at conferences where, usually meat is the default and there's like a box you check to request a veg option. They just flip that so that veg is the default and people can check a box to request meat. And yeah, like somewhere between 15 and 30% of people will check that box to request meat, but most people are fine to stick with the veg default. And it doesn't really generate pushback because people still have that option. So, I've worked with a lot of companies and universities that implemented Meatless Mondays and actually had to walk it back because people hate being told what to do and they hate having something taken away from them. And even the name meatless, it's like emphasizing what's not there.
What's not there.
Yeah. And so people are like, I'm not a child, like you can't tell me what to eat. It gets into a bad kind of like struggle. Like it's like a power struggle where just for the, just to make a point, people want to eat meat because you're telling them not to. So with this, like people still have that option. They're still, still have freedom of choice to opt into meat. It's just no longer the default option. So it's kind of helping like set this norm of plant-based, more sustainable, more inclusive foods, and then saying, hey, if you want meat with every meal, like that's fine. You can do that. You can opt into it, but we're not going to assume that everyone wants meat with every meal.
So like a maybe meatless Monday ?
Well, but not just about like default meatless every day, but if you want meat, it's still there for you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there like some coffee shops that are embracing that a default plant milk option, and which is a great first step. And it's like when one small coffee shop in the corner of the world does that, then it just makes big plant-based headlines, which is like, oh my gosh, they're making oat milk the default, and that's great. Then they get all this positive attention, and then others want in on it, and that's really valuable. That to bring in that psychological element and basic human behavior, and make sure that they're still in power and that they still have control and that they're not missing on anything. By opting in, because it's just, this is the default, and it makes it a norm and less of a weird fad kind of thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting talking to people about this because most people have just never even thought about the fact that meat is the default. We've never questioned it. Like, a lot of people who aren't vegetarian don't even think about the fact that meat is the default almost everywhere. And then like, oh yeah, why is that? And should it be that way? Does it need to be that way? Like, what's the benefit of it being that way? What are the downsides? And yeah, it's kind of amazing. I've gotten pretty much no pushback so far on this program because it's hard to argue with when everyone still has freedom of choice. You're just making the healthier and more sustainable option the default and letting people opt into meat. Like, I've yet to hear anyone like articulate an argument against that.
For sure. So so how would you describe the work that you do with, say, restaurants or schools or even caterers? So what does it look different for each of these collaborations?
Yes, it does. So I'm working primarily with corporations. My main focus is on businesses and working on like cafeterias and catering. So it works easiest for conferences, which is where it's been tested, and events where like or meetings where people are RSVPing and there's a box they can check to request a meet. That's like the simplest implementation. But we have strategies for implementing it in any environment. So at like, food is being served like family style or buffet, either at a meeting or even at like a potluck or something like that. It can look like having all the entrees be vegan, like everything plant-based. And then at the end of the line, there's some dairy and some meat, like as add-ons that people can put on their plate. So again, it's there. No one is going to like raise a huge ruckus that they're being deprived of their meat, but it's no longer like by default the bulk of the meal that people are eating. In restaurants, it can, in some places actually we're already used to this in certain environments, like for salads or bowls where the base is plant-based and people can pay extra to add on chicken or beef or whatever, or cheese, sour cream. Like we're used to them, so, or like with burritos. So just applying that to other types of food where like again the base is plant-based and people can add on, either their request or ideally they pay extra for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no extra for tofu or falafel.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's one thing that we really encourage is that to make sure that like plant-based entree has adequate protein and is super filling, because we've definitely seen that it's an issue that I've run into before where the base will be vegan, but it's like just veggies. And so that's people eat it and they're hungry like 10 minutes later because there's no protein in it. So yeah,
Right.
that's something else that we consult with is like making sure that it's very hearty and satisfying.
Yeah, and I think when we want that plant-based default to also be what folks are willingly opting into, the surcharge for adding the plant protein is probably going to be either less or non-existent when compared to the animal protein. And which is interesting because that's a lot of the campaigns that, like for Starbucks, for example, the campaign to end the plant milk upcharge. And just those few cents can make or break one's decision to choose dairy milk or the plant milk. And I think if plant milk were to be either not, there is no upcharge and it's the same charge as dairy, it looks like there will be more people opting in for that choice. So it's either leveling the playing field and not putting the plant option at a disadvantage. And I think campaigns like the default veg campaign is going to be very important. And when we have larger corporations and these, great meetings and conferences, or they're having these important conversations and could make a huge difference in the world by just going default veg. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and absolutely. And like you were saying earlier, like so much of it comes down to like just social pressures and perceptions. And that upcharge for plant-based milk, I mean, part of it is financial, but
Yeah.
For most people, like 25 cents, 50 cents isn't going to break the bank, but it still creates this perception that it's kind of like a luxury. It's like unusual. It's not necessary. I'm going to be different if I'm doing that. And so just all these like really subtle, almost subconscious cues that we're getting. So that really is our goal, is to have it be the opposite. We're like, yeah, all these major restaurants, all these major corporations, all these major like environmental events, they all have plant-based defaults. Then that, that creates this norm of like, oh yeah, plant-based can be totally normal and desirable. And then meat becomes like the special, or not specialty, but people have to think about whether they want it or not.
Yeah.
And have to make that conscious choice.
Yeah.
And I think with all these large, huge events like the Met Gala and the Oscars and the Golden Globes, like with all of them going plant-based for their menu, which hopefully COP26 does as well.
Oh.
It's like literally everyone who should be, I mean, I feel like everyone should be doing it, but the event where that would have been the expectation, that seems to be a struggle to happen. But regardless,
it's such a Gala went vegan before COP20.
I know, it's hilarious. And also, it's like, I want to laugh at it, but it's also frustrating, you know, it's frustrating and hilarious at the same time. So that actually leads me to a question that I had for you, is when there are these dire news, like these news headlines and these people with power to actually put in policy or actually put forth the behavior, like you said, that could dictate how a lot of policies are made, and they don't do that. They go by the status quo, they go by the norm, but these are people who could very easily have that influence. So how does that impact your outlook on where we are as a movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely frustrating, and there's a lot of disturbing headlines day in and day out. But, you know, I mean, I just on a personal level, I try to focus on the positive. And, you know, I've been vegan for 16 years now, and it's just like unimaginable how far we've come since then. I did not think that we would have, you know, vegan burgers at Burger King and Carl's Jr. and like, you know, have these like mainstream politicians supporting bills to like end factory farming by 2050. I mean, that was, again, just unimaginable. So, you know, I kind of hold both things simultaneously, which is that it's not happening fast enough. Like climate change is terrifying, and like
I know, and it's like, do we even have time till 2050? But at the same time, I like that you brought that up, because how do we balance the progress that's being made and commend that progress, because, you know, positive reinforcement works, the pace at which we need to see this change. So it's like, good job, can you do it a little quicker, please?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think just like you said, like taking time to celebrate the victories, and, you know, I think that's something like progressive movements in general have trouble with, because we always see how much farther there is to go, but yeah, it just leads to burnout if you don't take time to like celebrate the good that is happening. But not, you know, not like resting on our laurels.
Yeah, definitely. And do you feel like, so like when you describe how, say, the default veg campaign works, and it's like, hey, we're still having these animal product options for you to opt in on, do you feel like there's pushback from, you know, maybe the more hardcore animal rights space, in that these kinds of efforts might be, quote unquote, diluting the core message of the movement? Is that a concern, or have you experienced anything like that?
I haven't. I mean, I'm sure people would have that criticism of it, but I don't really concern myself with that. You know, like if you want to go out there and try to get Fortune 500 companies to be 100% vegan, like go ahead. I don't think you're going to get very far, you know, like if we can get them to be 60% vegan, like that is a huge win that, you know, if done on a large scale, like that has really concrete impacts on supply and demand, and also on like the culture at large and norms. So I do see this as a really effective strategy. And actually, I think that, I mean, for the reasons I've described in terms of human psychology, it's critical to its success that animal products are still there as an option, just because it doesn't create that pushback. Because, you know, what we've seen is like 15 to 30% of people are like hardcore meat eaters who are gonna opt into it. And if that option weren't there, those people would be raising hell, and they would get I can't tell you how many like companies and universities I've talked to that walked back their Meatless Monday because of that 10% of omnivores who were just furious and super persistent. And so, you know, if we can appease that 10% of people and get, you know, 80% of carnivores or omnivores to instead be like flexitarian, like set off, you know, down that road, to me, that is absolutely worth it. And, you know, I feel like when I deal with this mentality more, it's more from the environmental movement. I speak to a lot of environmental audiences, and they are often upset about like Impossible and Beyond and clean meat, cultivated meat, that these are like, you know, kind of, they're using GMO soy, or they're these big
Oh.
like corporate owned entities. It's like, you know, private patents. And so it's perpetuating this like, you know, corporate owned food system, all of that stuff. You know, I agree. I mean, I would love to see a more democratized food system that with like more local food and organic and all that. But again, it's like we have this crisis. It's not even on our doorsteps. It's like in our house. Like we need to end factory farming yesterday. We need to end it like 20 years ago. And so just like I think we can't like tomorrow people aren't going to suddenly convert to like entirely small scale organic agriculture. Like tomorrow we're not going to get everyone overnight to go vegan. So it's like I don't know, I'm willing to do like whatever seems the most feasible in order to create the largest change as quickly as possible. And I think that demanding 100% perfect veganism, you get a small percentage of people to change, but that's not going to end factory farming.
Yeah, and it's not going to bring the scale that we need. So that's a very, very, and I understand can be difficult as when you're really entrenched in the ethics of it and having these conversations with larger entities who are not willing to compromise on having some animal products on the table, and like being able to have these conversations with people and being able to switch from, okay, I'm not the hardcore ethical activist, but I am talking to someone who I hope will make this connection down the line, and what's the best way to engage with this person such that they do in the future. And who knows, maybe join the movement.
Yeah, I mean, and that's always my approach is like, you know, whether I'm just talking to a random person or whether I'm talking to a company, it's like, yeah, how do I connect with this person? How do I like speak in a way that resonates with them, that's respectful of them, and will leave them like wanting to continue to engage. And that's how I've had success with every kind of activism, basically.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and I really admire how you talk about strategy and how empirical data informs your strategy with what you're doing. So if you were to extrapolate that, it probably won't be a one for one, but if you were to extrapolate that same model into how grassroots activism or pressure campaigns work, in your opinion, what would a suitable model look like for how we can have this data, the history of the animal rights movement? So there is some sort of data there. There are some studies as to what works, what doesn't work, and people seem to be delving into that in a more academic setting as well. So from your experience, what do you think that would look like to inform other campaigns? So say the anti-fur campaign is really big right now. So how can we use this model for other animal rights campaigns?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's harder. And you know, I don't have as much expertise in this, but I think looking at examples of other victories, like what's worked in other analogous campaigns, and you know, trying to figure out like who is your target and why. Like, and you know, with fur, for instance, like often it's influencers, it's celebrities, it's people who would be wearing fur, who the fashion designers want to cater to. It might be, you know, the banks that are supporting these fur farms and giving them the loans. Like, you know, taking a really, not just going with like our first gut instinct of like, oh, this feels good, or like, this is easy, like, I'm just going to do this. But like, you know, really taking a minute to step back and look at the full picture of like, okay, why is this happening? And like, what are all the different parts to it? Like, who is making this happen? Who's, you know, I think there's two different ways it can go. Like one, what is the lowest hanging fruit? Like who do I have the most access to who would make a difference? But also like, you know, I forget the exact phrase, but like, you know, one stroke at the roots is worth like 1,000 strokes at the branch. Like that idea of like, if you can get to the root cause, then that is really where we should be focusing our time. So yeah, it's, you know, it's tough. It's not like the answers to that aren't always apparent. But there's a really great book, Lean Impact, it talks about nonprofit work and really taking time to assess what's the most effective use of our time and will get us where we want to go. There's a great example in there that I really like. There was this group that wanted to stop deforestation in Southeast Asia. And they, were thinking of doing either like a campaign or trying to like buy up land. And they went there and they actually talked to the villagers who were selling the land that was being deforested. And they found out that most of them were selling the land because they needed money for medical care for relatives because there wasn't any health care like anywhere near their village. And so it was tremendously expensive to transport people to hospitals really far away, and they were desperate for money. And so this campaign ended up building medical centers in these villages so that people didn't need the money and didn't have to sell their land. And it was hugely successful. But, if you're not like really immersed in it and looking at it from a systems perspective, you'd probably just go there and spend a lot of money on signs saying like, don't cut down trees, and they wouldn't do anything.
Yeah, it's like you're barely putting a Band-Aid on the issue, or if anything, you might be making it worse by just, like telling them that their issues aren't important and they're causing more problems versus
exactly
going into the root of it. So that's a wonderful example, and I think a very valuable piece of advice when it comes to strategy and planning a campaign and knowing every angle and like secondary targets, tertiary targets, and all that good stuff, and really think about it and not just go with your first response, as you said. Like we have that prefrontal cortex. Let's put that to use.
Exactly.
Yeah. I really loved all that you've said, and your journey through connecting with your own ethic and letting that guide you has been it's really inspiring. So along the way, are there any mentors that you feel were crucial along your journey who I guess you could you probably didn't realize at the time that they were a mentor in your life? Because we are the Animal Activism Mentorship Program, so we really want to showcase all of these amazing mentors on our podcast, but also those who've been mentors to them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've had so many mentors, I can't even count. Like, most of them from the animal rights community, and a lot of them like friends of mine. We're kind of like in this struggle together and supporting each other and learning from each other. So yeah, it's been a huge part of my journey, and that community has been absolutely critical for everything that I've done. One thing that I wanted to say I just wanted to like get this out there before I forget. Just a message that I'd love to give to your community is that, people I think often have more power than they realize within institutions that they work for, or if they're students like within that institution. I think, I had this idea, and most of us have this idea, that like we need to work for an animal rights organization in order to make change. But actually, like people on the inside are the most powerful voice for making change. And so I think there's a really strong argument to be made for vegans kind of embedding themselves within non-animal rights organizations. And that's, like whether that's like political campaigns or within companies. I know I had a friend who was a sustainability director for a company. They made like sports supplements, and several of their products had whey in them, and just like no one at the company was vegan, and they just hadn't really thought about it. And she was like, hey guys, like if we took out the whey, then this would be vegan and you could get more sales and like, cut the carbon footprint. And they were like, okay. And like, just because there hadn't been that vegan voice in the room, they had never thought of that before. So, and she's someone who was like not thrilled initially about working for a non-vegan company, but she was able to make this change. And so I think there's a lot of power in that. Like if folks have expertise in other areas, and I mean, for me, it's super valuable. Like much of the success I've had is through networking with vegans who work for corporations and are able to bring me in to give a presentation to the green team. And then I connect with the sustainability director and kind of like work it from there. But it takes people on the inside to bring this message in and have people take it seriously. So, folks have a lot more power than they realize. And it wasn't actually till after I graduated from university that I realized like how much power students have also over dining and like university policies. So yeah, people have more power than they know, like within the whatever institutions they're embedded in.
Totally. No, that's That's very, very valuable piece of advice. And thank you so much for those words of wisdom.
Of course.
Yeah. And so if our listeners who feel drawn to activism, they want to be an advocate for animals, but the pressure campaigns, the demonstrations, the disruptions, that's not calling to them. Have you experienced something like that where you felt like you had to go out there, but it wasn't really your thing, so to speak, to go and do a demo or a disruption? Is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I felt it more with other types of activism, like not animal rights activism. With animal rights activism, I've always just felt really called to talk to people about it. So like engaging in dialogue. So for me, it's more presentations or leafleting or tabling, just like trying to get that information out there. I mean, for me, it's more like, again, back in the day, like with Occupy, or like Black Lives Matter, like those types of protests where I felt like obligated to get out there on the street. But I mean, it's scary. Like I was at an Occupy Oakland protest, and people were being beaten by police and there was tear gas, and like it was not my scene. Like it's just, I'm not very like physically brave, or like I don't have an easy time putting myself in like physically dangerous situations. I feel like most animal rights protests don't get that intense. So but also I don't know, because I've seen, like, just from myself, like I was most moved by people like talking to me really patiently and like in a friendly way. And I've had so much success with that I've never, well, I've been to fur demos and things like that. Like, but in terms of like action for farmed animals, that's just never to me seemed like the most effective type of action for me to take. But I think overall, just for people to really just do what you're good at, like, and what you enjoy. And there's so many different ways that you can help out in a movement, like, making signs. Like we need people who are really good at arts, or like making memes, or like, infographics. If you're good at graphic design, like web design and coding is tremendously helpful. People who are good at talking to people, like development work and like fundraising is really important. Or, again, just like bringing people into your whatever like sphere of influence that you have. If you don't feel comfortable bringing that message, like finding other people who you can then bring in to share that message. And even just living by example or leading by example is so powerful, like more so than people know. And it can be slow, but it's happened to me so many times that just like people that I did not think I was getting through to, like years later, would go vegetarian or vegan, or even sometimes become activists. And like they've shared that, like seeing my journey and like seeing that I stuck with it, and like I seem really healthy and happy. And I like, if you share photos of food and like fun restaurants that you're going to, just making it seem fun and appealing and like relatable to people is hugely important. So there's and like innumerable ways for people to help the cause without necessarily like getting out there on the front lines.
Oh, that's spot on. That's well said. And I think a lot of people do struggle with that, that expectation of what activism should look like, quote unquote, should look like, versus how one can present their own unique, wonderful being and still advocate for something that they truly, truly believe in. And there is value in all of that. And it's literally all hands on deck. We need everyone doing the best that they can for the animals. And the more we get that message out there, I think the more vegans who already resonate with the ethics will feel empowered and will feel that this is a safe community where they can use their skills and still, get mobilized for a cause that they already do believe in. So just if our listeners who really connect with the farmed animal rights angle, or either want to want to help out with more of the corporate outreach angle, how can they get involved with either FFAC and or the Better Foods Foundation?
Yeah, so if folks work at companies or university, or even if you're part of like a community group, we talked to a lot of environmental groups that you want to help bring a default veg policy, you can email me at katie@betterfoodfoundation.org. We have like 2 separately branded campaigns. So defaultveg.com is sort of like the general public facing one. And then it seems ridiculous, but through market research, we found that the name default veg seemed too radical for corporate audiences. Having veg in the name was scary to people. And so we have a website that's greenerbydefault.com. So that's the branding that we use for institutional audiences. So, if you are in a workplace and you're interested in bringing that, greenerbydefault.com is the resource for that. And then the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition speaks to all different ages of students. And we also speak to community groups and workplaces. We have different tailored presentations about all the different impacts of factory farming. And you can go to ffacoalition.org to learn more about that. And they also do really wonderful culture shift conversations and like kind of book groups to help build community around these issues. So I recommend folks check that out too.
That's all great. And do we, normally have that last, like this mic drop question of what advice you would give to a room full of new activists, but you've kind of touched on words of wisdom here and there. So I guess I will, instead of that, be what, as a mentor in this space who's, you've done so many great things and you're continuing to do some brilliant work, what book or podcast or movie or documentary would you recommend to someone who is wanting to embark on their plant-based /vegan/animal rights journey?
I have to make a guilty admission here, which is that I actually, this is sort of, I guess you could say it's part of my self-care. Because I do this work full time, I don't really spend any of my time like reading or listening to podcasts like related to animal rights activism.
I do that's totally valid, because I did have a point about activism self-care, so you have addressed that as well.
Right, yeah, I pretty much exclusively read fiction because in my downtime, like I need to unplug and disconnect from the issue at some point. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't like, not that I never read books or listen to podcasts, but that's kind of just the first impulse that jumps to mind is I don't like immerse myself in the latest media all the time because it's, I need to at some point like have a break from it.
Totally. Yeah, no, I definitely understand that. So I guess we can, instead of that, a plant-based dish that you would serve to a vegan skeptic to show them that plant-based food is equally delicious and you don't need animal products to jazz up your meal.
Yeah, that one I can definitely answer, and it's seasonally appropriate. So there's a recipe for butternut squash Alfredo from Isa Chander Moskowitz on Post Punk Kitchen. That is divine. It's like maybe my favorite recipe of all time. It's super easy too, and it seems very fancy. There's like white wine and sage in it, and it never fails to impress.
Oh, that sounds absolutely glorious. Oh my gosh. Okay, this is going to be my my question, like my wrap-up question moving forward. So I can get just a personal agenda so I can get some fun recipe ideas as well. Great. Thank you so much, Katie. You are doing some phenomenal work, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to find immense value in all the resources that you've provided. And just keep on doing all the great work, and you just keep inspiring us all.
Well, likewise. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shriya. I really enjoyed talking with you. This was wonderful. And thanks for all the work that you're doing too.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. Please be sure to rate and review the podcast. It really helps get the word out, and the more people find out about it, the more they can be inspired by the fabulous guests we have on. And that can only turn into actionable change for the animals, right? Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the pod as well as all things AAM. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. So if you are waiting for a sign to get active for the animals, here you go. And lastly, remember that animal liberation is no easy undertaking. It takes all of us to come together, support one another, uplift each other, stay positive, focused, and be as effective as we can to put our best selves forward and create the world we wish to see for all Earthlings. Until next time.